We're coming to the close of the symbols phase, and also to the close of the way in which in nature there is an ecology of integration. One of the difficulties 300 years ago was that the layers of failed civilizations had built to an incredible complexity, like many layers, and then an earthquake of history hit and fractured so that the layers became displaced in a fault line in time. And the world has never healed since then. This is an amazing replay of something that happened in classical antiquity and left an impress that was like a fault line that was never healed in classical antiquity, and it has everything to do with the development of Judaism into Christianity. And because there was this fault line between the Jewish tradition in its complexity and the new occurrence that was not yet a tradition of Christianity, Christianity fell into a replay of a great deal of the confusion in the Jewish tradition, and so replayed itself out. And so about 600 years after Jesus, a completely new prophetic tradition began in Arabia by Muhammad. And Islam is like a Protestant Judaism that overlooks Christianity with some respect, but considers itself to have gone completely beyond. In the Quran, in one of the surahs, the only deep symbol that is there, that is shared with the early Christian tradition, other than the ascription of recognizing Jesus as a prophet in the line from Moses, is the cave of the seven sleepers. And the cave of the seven sleepers was outside of one of the large cities of the ancient world, Ephesus. You're probably familiar in the New Testament where there are letters from Paul to the Ephesians, the citizens of Ephesus. It's a huge city on the coast of what is today Turkey. Asia Minor at that time was famous in antiquity as having the largest temple to a god, actually to a goddess, in the ancient world. Ephesus had a temple to Artemis, the goddess who is the sister pair with Apollo, and her temple in antiquity was almost 900 feet long. That's 3 football fields. It was huge, it was enormous. The Cave of the Seven Sleepers was on the outskirts of Ephesus, and it was the place that Mary Magdalene was buried. The reason she was buried in the Cave of the Seven Sleepers is because the cave had been reserved as a burial entombment, as a kind of proto-catacomb by St. John, who was raised by Mary Magdalene from the time that he was just a youngster. When Jesus died in 36 AD, St. John was still a boy. He was only 11 years old. He had not yet had a bar mitzvah. And that's why at the Last Supper, when Jesus says, "One of you is going to betray me," St. John put his head on Jesus' shoulder and said, "Is it me, Lord?" Because he was still a boy and he was under the care of Jesus, who was a very mature man at that time. He was 44 years old. He was born in 9 BC. On the cross, when he was being crucified, one of the final things that Jesus did as a man was to give over the care of finishing raising St. John to Mary Magdalene, and said to her that you will now be responsible for his maturation. And Mary Magdalene is the one who saw to it that the young boy who grew up to be St. John had the finest education that he could have received in the ancient world. And that's why St. John's Greek is the highlight of what they call New Testament Greek. It is the most sophisticated language extant. It is like 2 levels above the next best writer. But St. John was famous twice in his life. He was famous once in his maturity. In antiquity, a man received his flourish at 40. He became fully empowered then to really do something at 40. And that's when St. John wrote his gospel. The second time that he was famous, he was near 90, and he had been commandeered by a Roman emperor named Domitian, who was one of the severest psychotic emperors in classic Rome, so that his reign was called the Terror of Domitian. And Domitian became afraid because of a fault line that ran through all of the Caesars because of Judaism and because of its association with nascent Christianity. One of the reasons that Nero burnt Rome down was to purify it. And his successor, Vespasian, had Jerusalem destroyed and the temple pulled down out of fear. That there was something deeply, magically charismatic that had happened to the Jews in relationship to Rome, or perhaps in relationship to the Greeks before, in the time of Alexander the Great. They were unsure. But one of the qualities that was there all through the 1st century AD in the emperors, every emperor after Augustus Caesar was haunted by and afraid and almost psychotically projective to handle the Jews or handle the Christians in a very special way. The fault line, the earthquake that happened in antiquity at the classical period, happened in 31 BC. It happened very much at the same time that Augustus Caesar won the Battle of Actium and became the first man to really commandeer world power unto himself without having to share it with anyone. He became the first of the true Roman emperors. And he ruled for 44 years. But the earthquake happened in what is today Israel. It was then called Palestine. It happened in Judea, and it happened exactly where the Jordan River comes down to the Dead Sea. It struck exactly where the Essene community was and had been for 130 years. They had been expecting a Messiah to come and refurbish God's kingdom on earth. And after 130 years in great travail and great application, an earthquake struck and sent a fault line directly through the center of the community, directly through the center of the purifying of the Essenes, their baptismal pond. And the earthquake split it almost in half, in a jagged half. And so Qumran, the Essene community, was abandoned as if God's wrath had warned them, what you are doing is not acceptable. And for some while, for about 20 years, Qumran was abandoned, and there was no one there. And the Essenes left and went out and began forming smaller communes, smaller communities. And they were like active ascetics, and so they were carpenters, and they were men who worked with their hands, made things out of iron, made things out of wood, craftsmen communities. Jesus' father, Joseph, was a crafts Essene in that way. But occasionally, Essenes were allowed by vision to marry and to have children to bring certain things into life and into the world. There was a woman, her name was Elizabeth, and she had a relative, like a distant niece, and her name was Mary. And Elizabeth was the mother of John the Baptist, and Mary was the mother of Jesus. And John the Baptist was born 6 months before Jesus. But when the realization came to the Roman-supported king, Herod, that something unexpected had occurred, that the Essenes had succeeded in making a refocus, and that the new Messiah had been born and was a baby, the order went out from Herod the Great to kill all male children under 2 in those community-related families, and it's called in traditional Bible history as the Massacre of the Innocents. There were only 2 male babies that survived. One of them was Jesus, because his father, Joseph, was a seer. It was Joseph who was the seer, not Mary. And Joseph took his family into Egypt, went back to Egypt and stayed there for 5 years. The mother of John the Baptist was old. She was much older. She couldn't have survived that kind of a stress, that kind of a journey. So she took the infant John the Baptist, and she went down into one of the abandoned caves alongside where the Essene community was at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. And so he was raised out of one of the Essene caves on the shore of the Dead Sea. And because his mother, Elizabeth, was very old, she died very soon afterwards. And so John the Baptist was literally raised by a group of men, of Essenes, who came back into the area, and they brought him up. And so John the Baptist was raised in one of the most severe ascetic childhoods anyone probably has ever had. His food, the traditional description is that he survived on honey and locusts. In other words, on wild forage that you could find in the desert. He'd never had regular meals. He never lived in town at all. And he grew up spiritually wild in the sense, not wild like a beast, but wild like a almost otherworldly, almost like an alien who belonged in God's world and not in man's world. Jesus in Egypt was raised very much in a visionary tradition that had the remembrance of all kinds of inner images, inner symbols. And by the time he was 5, when they went back, Herod the Great had died. Joseph was able to move his family back, not into the Judean area where Bethlehem was, where he was born, but in the wilder north in Galilee, which at that time, Galilee was to Judea, much like in Canada, British Columbia is to Ontario. It's the outer edge, it's wild, and if you go further from Galilee, then you get into Syria, you get into Damascus, you get back into civilization. But Galilee at the time was like the Wild West of Palestine. And they attempted to put the 5-year-old Jesus into a school, into a traditional school. And he didn't get along with the teacher at all. Because the report is, he asked the teacher how he could teach him and said, "If you will tell me what your alpha is, I will tell you what your omega is." And so he was not allowed to go to school. He was too precocious. And so he was raised largely by his visionary father, Joseph, and trained at home. And by this time, there was a brother. He had several brothers and a sister. His brother, James, was also born by that time. And so they were the 2 older boys, and they were raised St. James. And Jesus and James were raised very similar, but in a more refined visionary tone from John the Baptist. So these 3 men, these 3 extraordinary individuals were all raised about the same time, except that when Jesus was 12, he left the tutelage of his father, Joseph, and he went back to Egypt because he had become accepted by one of the most refined ascetic communities in the world at that time. It was about 25 miles to the west of Alexandria. It's a site anciently called Taposiris. The Greeks called it Taposiris Magna. And there was the community there of the contemplatives called the therapeutai, the healers. And so Jesus was raised in that community, and being extraordinary beyond belief, by the time he was 21, 22, he was the head of the community already. The only document that survives from antiquity is On the Contemplative Life by Philo of Alexandria. And Philo is the most powerful of all the Hellenistic Jewish writers of that whole era. And one of the qualities about Philo is that his works were preserved not by the Jews but by the Christians. Because he was not called then Philo Judaeus, he was called Philo of Alexandria. And Philo of Alexandria was held to be one of the early church fathers. He was held to be one of the primordial Christians, Christian fathers. So much so that 300 years later, when the Roman Emperor Constantine sought to have a new religion to hold together a repositioned Roman Empire, not a Roman Empire that was centered on Rome, but a Roman Empire centered on his city called Constantinople, that became Byzantium, that became Istanbul. He rebuilt a new Rome. He didn't burn down the old Rome like Nero did, but he built a new Rome because the old Rome had always had the Greek mythological, Roman Greek mythological gods as the foundation of the Roman state. And so he wanted to have a new Rome with a completely new religion, and he chose Christianity to be that religion. Constantine himself had absolutely no affinity with Christianity. The tradition is that on his deathbed, he agreed to have somebody say a blessing over him, and that was it. He was a tough guy, Constantine. But he was like Roman emperors for 3.5 centuries. He was a very smart politician on an imperial scale. And so he wanted to have Christianity brought together in all of its major variants, of which there were many by that time, and he wanted to have one single true lineage of Christianity. And the person that he chose to run this conference, to go on for several years and make sure that they got it all exact and right, the head man was named Eusebius. And his history of the development of the Roman Catholic ethos of the Roman Empire, his ecclesiastical history, still survives today and is one of the major documents in world history. And he says, Eusebius says many times in his work, that Philo is definitely a Christian. He's not a Jew. Because the deepest esoteric initiations and traditions of Christianity, all the way through from the beginning, are honestly and accurately reported by Philo. We know he was a Christian because that's how we hold Christianity in its deepest, most esoteric truth. By these initiations, by these signs, by these symbols, by this material. One of the difficulties that came within about a generation from Eusebius, when Christianity was bureaucratically ensconced as the official religion of the new Roman Empire, it occurred to people in Philo's home city, in Alexandria especially, the bishop of Alexandria said, well, wait a minute. We're having a little bit of a chronological problem here. Philo died in the 40s AD. And Christianity, at the latest, he died in 45, maybe 46 AD. And Christianity didn't arrive in Alexandria until St. John, or St. Mark rather, brought it here from Rome. And that was 65 AD. You got a 20-year discrepancy here. And the reason that St. Mark brought Christianity to Alexandria, to Egypt in 65 AD, is that his mentor, St. Peter, was killed, was crucified in Rome that year. And so John Mark, who had been raised by St. Peter, John Mark was about the same age as St. John. John Mark's mother owned the house that the Last Supper was held in on the second floor. And so John Mark, as a boy, looked to Peter because he was the oldest, most mature. He was the rock of the apostles. And John Mark became his secretary. And so St. Mark was always with St. Peter. Only St. Peter had been not allowed to take over after the crucifixion of Jesus of the early Christian community in Jerusalem. That head was Jesus' brother, James. And James was not as forgiving as Jesus about Peter, and made it clear to him that there were depths that were beyond Peter's possibility of understanding and appreciating, and that there were deeper mysteries concerned with Jesus than Peter was able to plumb. And so Peter, with John Mark, left Jerusalem, and his letters are written from a place called Babylon. And traditional Christian history says, well, how did Peter go to Babylon all the way on the Euphrates River? Well, he didn't. Because the Roman garrison fortress in Egypt, outside of what is today Cairo, what was then the remains of Memphis, at the place where the Nile Delta opens up from the spinal column of the Nile River, right there where the medulla would be and the psychoneural system was the Roman garrison fortress, and it was called Babylon. And that's where Peter went with Mark. And so when Peter was killed, Mark indeed went to Egypt, but he didn't go to Alexandria. He went back to Babylon. He went back outside of the Roman garrison fortress, because that's where the original church of Mark was and still is. It's on the outskirts of Cairo. Because the ancient tradition was that once a holy ground was established, you do not ever desecrate it. That the only thing you can do is build around it. And so a second church was built around the initial little cubbyhole church that St. Mark taught in originally, 65, 66 AD. And over the course of several centuries, as Christianity grew quite wealthy, a third church, even larger, was built, and that church, with the church inside of it, with the original room of St. Mark, is still there in Cairo today. You can go and visit it. The chair he sat in, the podium he used to sermon from is still there, still held by the Coptic Christian Church. The problem became exacerbated when they realized neither Paul, nor Peter, nor Mark, Luke comes many decades later, none of them ever went to Alexandria. St. John was raised in Ephesus by Mary Magdalene. Matthew never went there. None of the disciples ever went there. How did Philo become a Christian father? The earliest one. Because the only possible teacher left is Jesus himself. Jesus founded Christianity, or what became Christianity, himself in Alexandria first. And the description in Philo's On the Contemplative Life of the head of the therapeutic community speaking is an eyewitness to Jesus' teaching, deeper than anything in the New Testament. And he says in there that the head of the community is not necessarily the oldest person, that there are occasionally the most brilliant is someone who is younger. And he talks about how there was in this delivery a silence that happened in the room, and there were men and women together in the room, women on one side, men on the other, listening to this sermone in Latin is actually not a sermon that somebody says at you, but is a flow of inspired language that comes not from a mythic experience, but comes from a visionary consciousness. It comes from above, down, and not from the culture up. And Philo says that when this speaker spoke, there was a silence in the room, and then there was a silence within the silence that entered one's mind. And in the silence within the silence that was now your mind, when the language was said orally, it engraved on the souls of the hearers a secret language that wasn't heard until later. That later, when they would remember what they heard physically, they would remember the secret language and not the spoken language, not the mythic flow of oral language, but the esoteric, remembered, conscious meaning. And so Philo is famous in antiquity as being the master of a literary technique that was developed progressively in Hellenistic Judaism. The first person to use it was the teacher of righteousness, the author of the book of Daniel, the author of the Thanksgiving hymns and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the author of the book of Job. And about 200 years later, Philo had refined the allegorical method of language to its highest degree ever attained in the classical world. Now, allegory, in Greek, it's a combination of two words. Allos means other, and allegory means speaking. It means other speaking. It means that two things are being said at the same time. One is being orally delivered on the mythic horizon. The other is that the meaning has jumped in transform out of the mind through the symbols into a spiritual consciousness, and that spiritual consciousness is able to come in and make images in the mind just like the mythic horizon can make images in the mind. So that the mind now is not just reflective of experience, but is a transparent, open frame that has symbols coming from both directions. From universal spiritual consciousness and from worldly, experiential, mythic feeling. And so one has two distinct ways at the very same time. And what it did was to make symbols, the symbol mind, capable of seeing two ways at once, exactly at the same time. One way was to look back through experience all the way back to nature and see the natural truth of things. The other was to look all the way back through a historical process and see the cosmos, the cosmic meaning of it. So that one saw nature and cosmos at the same time, in the same language, in the same mind, but it was a mind that instead of being focused one time, was focused like an hourglass, that it had two references at the same time. One to a historical sense of the cosmos, and the other to a mythic sense of nature at the same time. All of this was scrambled in 365 AD, about 40 years after Eusebius. The reason why it was scrambled was that there was a Roman emperor who decided that all of the esoteric traditions were not at all then just this pagan Greek mythology and this Roman pagan Greek mythology, but that it was an allegorical presentation of a very deep wisdom that went all the way back to secret Egypt. And so he sought to bring back this ancient tradition, and he was killed for it because he was threatening the entire structure of the Roman official religion and empire. And after he was killed, being led by the Alexandrian bishop, there was a pogrom against esoteric, allegorical understanding of Christianity and of Judaism. And that's why the Nag Hammadi manuscripts that were found, the 13 books that were hidden in Egypt, outside the little village Nag Hammadi, and they were found about the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were likewise hidden, but in a previous tyranny. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts were all buried in 365 AD because it was a penalty of death of holding such literature and such material. You could not have it, they will kill you. And so time and time again, after all of these kinds of fractures and confusions and overlays, by the time that Sir Isaac Newton, this universal math genius, had written his Principia Mathematica, he devoted the last 30 years of his life to try to understand the mystery of the Bible, of Christianity especially, and of Christianity and Judaism. And Newton put his superhuman intelligence to work, and he focused on two books, Daniel, the book of Daniel, and the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation of St. John. He knew that in between these two books, that they acted as some kind of esoteric parenthesis, and that if one could understand what had happened in that parenthesis, one would understand then the truth that was there behind all the fractures, all the confusion, all the different layers. And Newton found that the core of the whole thing was a mystery involved with light. And so Newton wrote The Optics, one of the greatest books of all time. It was first published in 1704. This is a reprint of the fourth edition of 1730. And by the time Newton's Optics came out, he understood that light is truly alchemically mysterious because it is two things at the same time. It is a process of waveform at the same time that it is little minute atomic bits of matter, all at the same time. By the middle of the 1700s and all the way through the 1800s, the development of chemistry and physics all said, well, this can't possibly be. It has to be one thing or the other. To be rational, it must be one thing. And the 19th century said, well, Newton obviously settled on particles, that light is particles, and we know that that's not true because we have all the Faraday's work with magnetism and electricity and Maxwell's equations that show that light is a wave. It can't possibly be particles also. And it wasn't until Einstein's great intelligence that he discovered that there is a particle that carries lights called the photon, and it is definitely a particle. And light is both a wave and a particle at the same time. It is really mysterious. Let's come back. Let's take a break. Let's come back to, we're trying to appreciate here towards the close of our phase of symbols, and we're trying to appreciate in a very specific way the core of ancient wisdom was always mysterious because it had two qualities at the same time. It's like the effect of the sacredness of frankincense or myrrh. It evokes two different qualities at the same time. One, a quality which is psychophysical, and the other, a quality which is spiritual, high remembrance at the very same time. In order to cement any kind of rule in terms of the world, there has to be a reduction of that secret pairedness to a oneness. Tyrannies are always based on we have the answer. It's always that way. Or egos are, it is this way. And yet, it seems reasonable that isn't reality oneness? And the response to that is, yes, reality in form is oneness. But form is only half of what is real. The other half, as it were, is actually a pair to oneness, to unity, and the pair to unity is zero or infinity. Can be either way. It's just as logical either way. It can be the zeroness of mysterious nature, or it can be the infinity of differential cosmos at the same time. And the unity is held by the integration and the whole cycle of integration that comes into its final form as the mind. And so the mind must be unified. It has to take an objective form, and its objective form, the traditional word for it is order. And it is related directly by alignment to the traditional unity of existence. But existence's unity is not order, it is structure. And so there's an alignment between structure and order that creates integration in a very interesting way. It's like structure would be like a single line. In Sanskrit, that single line is called sutra. It means thread. That single line of structure fits into a double line, which is order, and they fit in such a way that they come together as an alignment, an identification then that is certain. And so the mind and existential objects definitely come into that kind of a cinch. It is true. But the origins of the mind's objective order are different from the origins of the structure of existence. The structure of existence emerges out of a process always called nature. And to confuse existence with nature is a primary flaw. It just means someone is not mature, never been educated right. And that the origin of the mind's order is out of experience, not out of nature. And so one has to understand that there is a syncopation between phases of process and phases of form, and that they go together like bacon and eggs. They belong together. They go together. But unless you can get that initial learning of the syncopation of the way in which there is a rhythm to reality, one of the classic ways of saying it in the middle of the 20th century was maybe the most intellectually precocious of all the Indian masters. His name was Vinoba Bhave. He was the successor to Mahatma Gandhi. And he was a universal genius, even more so than Sri Aurobindo. When Vinoba was 20, he came to Gandhi, and Gandhi looked at him with spiritual insight and said, "You're a giant." He said, "I want you to go to the center of India and found an ashram there, and I want you to study every major religious book in history. And when I need you, I will call for you." And so Vinoba established in the center of India an ashram. It's a place he created. It's called Wardha. And it's in the geographic center of India, not far from Sanchi. The greatest Buddhist stupa of the ancient world is there at Sanchi, and Wardha is not far from it. And Gandhi left him there for more than a generation. Never talked to him, never wrote him. And so Vinoba studied every language, learned them all. He read the Quran in Arabic. He read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in Sanskrit. He read the Bible in Greek. And he read every language, every major language in history. And the whole development then, after Gandhi was gone, and Vinoba didn't know how to present what he knew to the world, he got up from Wardha, because Gandhi had only sent for him once, to head to be what was called a truth-holding warrior, a satyagrahi. And when World War II broke out in India, Vinoba was chosen as the only satyagrahi. He went to sit and hold truth in front as a demonstration against the British Empire. He was arrested within 10 minutes, put in jail, let go, and that was the last anybody ever saw him. And so when Gandhi was dead, killed, he didn't know what to do, and so he began just walking. And that's when it hit him. And his famous phrase, "Walking is the correct pace of thinking." It's not standing still that gives you the clarity of thought. Sitting in meditation gives you the clarity of the unity of existence, but not of the mind. The clarity of the order, unity of the mind, is made through walking. And it is that walking sometimes that comes into a language form called the dialogue, or the drama, the plays, the thing. And so one learns that the order of the mind is made by ratioing proportionately, and that's why it's called rational. It has a rational order, not that this is the order, but that this is the way in which all proportionates happen in the universe. And so the mind becomes ratioable. I used to call it ratios of the real. And when you learn in such a way, and the only way to learn that in such a way is to go through some kind of presentation like we're going through. Only this presentation is a 21st century development of it. It's based on the complementarity of modern physics and astrophysics. and that the origin of that is Newton's optics, where he learned to see. And once he learned to see that light is both wave and particle, he didn't know, it took 200 years to find the photon. The photon was not identified. Einstein theoretically came upon that there must be a carrier of light energy called the photon, and it wasn't found until 1923. It was the first particle, subatomic particle, found after the electron, which was found in 1896. It meant that light, when it carries energy, is a particle, and when it carries itself, it's a wave. And by carrying itself, it has a dynamic but does not have a form. In the Vajrayana, sometimes referred to as clear light. But when light is formed, it has a spectrum. Every source of light in the universe, if put through a prism, will diffract a spectrum. And the spectrum isn't just the simple diffraction that Newton came on, is that if you hold a small prism in a dark room to a little shaft of sunlight, the sunlight is not sun-colored, it's not sunlight-colored, but it diffracts into the spectrum, the rainbow. That's why the cover has the rainbow on it. The 7 colors of the rainbow are all modulated. They're not jumbled together, but they're modulated together so that they fit as a unity which can be diffracted by prismatically. And so Newton saw, because he's very smart, like Vinoba, universal geniuses are really smart. He saw, well, then my mind will have a crystal form to it. The possibility of a crystal form where I can diffract the spectrum of reality and be able to see the full octave. And that's when he got interested for 30 years in trying to figure out what is it between the book of Daniel and the Apocalypse of John in that set that is so doggone significant and we can't get to, that we have intuitions about it, and that all through history you find various traditions, people, communities, mystics, seers, who get it that there is something going on here. Just exactly what is it? And Newton wanted to know what is it in terms of physical, mathematical exactness, and he could never quite get to it. But he left a body of work, his religious writings, that began to influence people, not mystics. They never read Newton. They considered him mechanistic. And not initially the poets. They were attracted later on to his theory of energy. Like Blake, energy in the imagination. There's where it is. But his first readers were people who could read his mathematics, who knew his science, and the most powerful of the scientific visionaries was a man from Sweden called Swedenborg, Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg was not only a physics and chemistry, mathematical genius, he was a practical man of the world. He was in charge of all the mines in Sweden. He was a mining engineer. But when he began to understand what it was that Newton was after, he started to wonder about his own mind. Well, then, if that's true, I should be able to find some kind of crystal form of my ordered mind that will allow for spiritual light to shine through and He was almost 50 years old when he had his first experience of doing that, and it shocked him. This was in the 1740s. And so for the rest of his life, Swedenborg, like Newton, devoted himself to mystical writings of trying to use this inner sight. Not a psychic like Edgar Cayce, not that way. A higher calibration. It's not using psychic energy, but it's using consciousness ratcheted up to a spiritual historical differential. That's where you get the really big dynamic. Because the forms that come out of that then are not only true spiritually, they're also true scientifically at the same time. You get them both. But they do not align, but they resonate together, and so they have correspondences rather than alignments. And so conscious differential ratioing is by correspondent harmonics rather than by ratioed geometrics. So you have a different quality that you have to bring into play. And so it takes an enormous patience to learn how both those come together and work in supposedly different ways, but when they work together, they form, the best word for it in the 20th century was, they form a complementarity. A complementarity. That's what Niels Bohr called it in quantum mechanics. There's a complementarity here. And it means that we can't use reductiveness on two distinct ways. We can't reduce it down to the material, nor can we reduce it up to the metaphysical. We have to watch out and not do either of those, which means keeping a balance, an equilibria, and the only place that can hold the fulcrum of that equilibria is the form of the mind ordered perfectly. And so it's the perfect mind that is the fulcrum upon which not a scale, not a teeter-totter, but what balances there is the process of consciousness, which is not a form at all, it's a process. And because it's a process, it doesn't have a measurable length. It has instead a swirl. It has a spiraling that occurs around a pivot. One of the most beautiful ways to visualize it, I'll try and bring it next week. Someone worked out a form by which all of the elements occurring in nature, from hydrogen to uranium, can be plotted on that kind of spiral curve. It's not just a spiral, but it's a spiral that constantly opens as it goes around. It's the form of the, in seashells, the chambered nautilus has that form. It's a universal form. It occurs anywhere in the universe. You'll find it. It holds true. It's the way in which all the elements that make up the universe can be ordered and arranged, not in rows, not in periodic tables of egg crate things, but in a continuous motion of conscious form, which is cosmic. It's a science thing. When William Blake was a young man and just newly married, he married the daughter of they used to call them in 18th century London greengrocers, somebody who grew vegetables and took it into the market and people would buy them. Blake's marriage to Catherine was like a real boon to him because he finally had somebody that he could just talk with all the time. And they got interested in Swedenborg. And so they went to one of these big conferences in London. And for a while, they were really taken up with it until finally Blake realized that there was something metaphysical about Swedenborg, and that he had gone off the far end in that direction. And so he wanted to distance himself from Swedenborg. And so he took one of Swedenborg's works called Heaven and Hell, which was like one of those things, these guys are going down, these guys are going up. And Blake took Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell and wrote a way to make them a complementarity of a larger reality. He called it the marriage of heaven and hell. And it was his first great visionary work. The Blake Trust, a long time ago, put out facsimiles of William Blake's works. This is a facsimile exactly of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, made in France. They took a copy that had once been owned by the Prime Minister of England in the British Empire, Benjamin Disraeli, and passed to a rich American. And they sent the manuscript over to France. They took it apart, and they reproduced it exactly on the same paper with the same watercolors. And they made just a couple of hundred copies. This is number 205. What's interesting is that in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he says, there's an illustration of a nude figure with the Great Pyramids of Giza. And it's about angels, and that one has to beware of the metaphysics of angels. I have always found that angels have the vanity to speak of themselves as the only wise. This they do with a confident insolence sprouting from systematic reasoning. Thus Swedenborg boasts that what he writes of is new, though it is only the contents or index of already published books. A man carried a monkey about for a show, and because he was a little wiser than the monkey, grew vain and conceived himself as much wiser than even the 7 men. It is so with Swedenborg. He shows the folly of churches and exposes hypocrites till he imagines that all religions and himself are the only single one. And so Blake began to realize that he was pretty much adrift in a peculiar world, because by the time he wrote this was 1790. The American Revolution had taken place a few years before. The French Revolution had just taken place, and so he considered that there was going to be a need for a new prophet. And so he wrote a couple of prophetic books, one America, a Prophecy, and two Europe, a Prophecy. And the front illustration to Europe, a Prophecy is one of the all-time great symbolic illustrations. It is the creator using a geometrician's instrument to draw the circles of the real. And Blake considered that he would have to become a prophet like the ancient prophets, especially in the Old Testament. That he would have to subject himself to the same, opening himself up to the prophetic energies of God. And then he would do something esoteric with it. He would make engravings on copper sheets. And these engravings then would be his impress directly from his spiritual vision, so that the plates themselves would only have the imagery from a spiritual vision. The writing would be backwards, and the pictures would be inside out. So that when paper was put onto those plates and printed, it would print out in a worldly way, that then the printing was right and the images were arranged right. but that the reader who would read it would read that printed page in such a way that it would imprint on his mind the other way, so that the mind would receive the vision directly from the esoteric printed sheets. So that by reading his prophetic books, you would literally recreate in your own mind a spiritual visioning that you wouldn't otherwise maybe have been ready for. And so he devoted the rest of his life to do this, to develop this technique. The person that got completely bound up into it at the end of the 19th century was W.B. Yeats. Because for Yeats, it wasn't just, we don't want to just reform the world, we want to recalibrate man so that he becomes indeed a cosmic spiritual being. We don't want to just fit into the world. You see, he wasn't a Londoner like Blake wanting to have a big order. He was an Irishman who wanted to, let's upset the order. Let's go back and redo the whole thing. And so Yeats became like an occult king. I once gave a lecture called Yeats and Jung, the only two magicians of the 20th century. They were really magicians, able to really do stuff. So Yeats, all his life, was concerned with trying to find where is it that one puts one's spiritual, occult, conscious, historical sense in order to regain the original place where the pivot once was still formed and might have gotten confused after that, but once we can get back there, where can we get to? And he wrote one of the most powerful poems of the 20th century called Sailing to Byzantium. He saw in his spiritual vision that somehow Byzantium, Constantinople, is involved with the esoteric pivot of the whole thing, where it was last whole in a way that one could then see from that fulcrum, from that pivot, the entire swirling field. He published it in 1928. The little volume of poems was called The Tower. And by the time of 1928, Yeats was already in his early 60s. He had a reputation of being the greatest poet of his age, of his time. But with The Tower, Yeats became unquestionably the most esoteric poet that we have had probably since Shakespeare. Here's how it begins. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long what is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. Unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress, nor is there singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages, in God's holy fire, is in the gold mosaic of a wall. Come from the holy fire, purn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but from such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. As soon as he was able to write on that level, he became flooded with visionary swirls, and not just himself, but what happens is if someone is close to you, they have exposure to that. It's like a radiation. And so Yeats's wife began getting automatic writing. It would just flood to her. And so she would write, and just write and write and write. A whole suitcase full of scribbled diagrams and writings. What it was, she didn't know, no one knew. Clinically, the psychological people of that time would have said, well, she's going crazy, she's going insane. But Yeats knew different. He knew that because it had a correspondence harmonic, there must be a way then to tune one's prismatic self to be able to read that in its new differential order. And so he spent years at it. Years. We're talking about somebody tremendously capable and talented. He was remember in the previous lecture, he was singled out as a young man by Madame Blavatsky as being one of the most special people on the planet. It really was. He used to practice telepathy as a teenager with one of his uncles in the west of Ireland. The uncle would walk up on a ridge and would think certain thoughts, and Yeats, as a teenager, would walk in the valley and he would pick up his uncle's thoughts. And he would train himself that way. It was unbelievably sensitive. And finally teased out from his wife's automatic writings a book which he published near the end of his life called A Vision. And in it began to find the diagrams of the complementarities, of the interpenetrating conic sections of a new kind of harmonic. And we're going to talk more about it next week. But one of the qualities that came out of it was the ability that somehow a master of art will know how to use a spiritual magic language so that the poems that are made are not just art forms, but they're magical language forms that will then be able to transform the ordering capacity of the mind away from old hierarchies into new jewels, new crystals. And so he used poetry on this level, that when someone hears it, their mind is recut into a prismatic lens like a jewel and slowly becomes acclimated to be able to see. The best term for it is the term I'll use for the first lecture of 2005. Vision 1, kaleidoscopic consciousness. So at the end of A Vision, he put this poem, and it's called All Souls' Night. Midnight has come, and the great Christ Church bell and many a lesser bell sound throughout the room, and it is All Souls' Night. And 2 long glasses brimmed with muscatel bubble upon the table. A ghost may come, for it is a ghost's right. His element is so fine, being sharpened by his death, to drink from the wine breath, while our gross palates drink from the whole wine. I need some mind that if the cannon sound from every quarter of the world can stay, wound in minds pondering, as mummies in the mummy cloth are wound, because I have a marvelous thing to say, a certain marvelous thing, none but the living mock, though not for sober ear. It may be that all that hear should laugh and weep an hour upon the clock. It's the first I call. He loved strange thought and knew that sweet extremity of pride that's called platonic love. And that to such a pitch of passion wrought, nothing could bring him when his lady died, anodyne for his love. Words were but wasted breath. One dear hope had he, the inclemency of that or the next winter would be death. Two thoughts were so mixed up, I could not tell whether of her or God he thought the most. But think that his mind's eye, when upward turned, on one sole image fell, and that's a sight companionable ghost, wild with divinity, had so lit up the whole immaculate, miraculous house. The Bible promised us, it seemed, a goldfish swimming in its bowl. And he goes on. And the last two stanzas, he calls up a couple of more ghosts. Not the three ghosts of Christmas past, but the three ghosts of a future all souls cosmos. But names are nothing. What matter who it be, so that his elements have grown so fine, the fume of muscatel can give his sharpened palate ecstasy. No living man can drink from the whole wine. I have mummy truths to tell, whereat the living mock, though not for sober ear, for maybe all that hear should laugh or weep an hour upon the clock. Such thought have I that hold it tight till meditation master all its parts. Nothing can stay my glance until that glance runs in the world's despite to where the damned have howled away their hearts and where the blessed dance, heaven and hell. Such thought that in it bound I need no other thing. Wound in minds wandering as mummies in a mummy cloth are wound. And so with that, Blake and Yeats left a heritage about the same time that atomic physics was born. And the atom was opened up for the first time, both theoretically and mathematically. And within 5 years of publishing a vision, the first atomic bomb opened up something that had always seemed to most people impossible to do. And yet, published at the same time as a vision was a book by Lord Rutherford called A Newer Alchemy, about the way in which mathematics and nuclear physics, even by 1937, saw that the transformation of matter as well as of the mind is the most real thing about the cosmos. It isn't that it exists that's so miraculous, or even that it has a rational order, but that it has an infinite, transformable range of possibility. More next week.